At 1:00 a.m., his son collapsed at the doorstep, face swollen, lips torn, whispering through sobs that his wife had beaten him because of her affair. The sight was a knife to the heart, every bruise screaming betrayal. He didn't cry, he didn't plead. He moved with deadly calm, slipping into his police uniform, loading his weapon, dialing his lawyer, and saying only 4 words that changed everything. Start the plan now. If you're watching, subscribe and drop a simple comment with your city, or even just a number. He wants to know how far this story will reach, because what comes next will leave you breathless. He had just come off a shift that felt endless, the kind of night where the city bled trouble on every corner. The sirens, the drunken fights, the pointless arguments at gas stations that turned into broken bottles and blood on the asphalt. It was all still buzzing in his head as he sank into the old couch. Boots still laced, body sinking deep, as if gravity itself wanted to pin him down. His eyelids flickered shut. The smell of sweat, gunpowder residue, and city grime clung to his uniform. His muscles ached the way only years of policing in a neighborhood that never slept could ache. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He thought maybe, just maybe, he'd steal a couple hours of sleep before the world demanded more from him. But then came the pounding. Not the polite tap of a neighbor needing a favor, not the sharp knock of a fellow officer stopping by. It was a desperate shaking rhythm, like someone slamming the door with their last ounce of strength. His instincts, honed from decades on the force, fired to life before his brain could catch up. He jolted upright, hand reaching for the chair by the door as if he were about to face down another suspect. His heart slammed against his ribs. It was 1 a.m. Who the hell was out there? The sound came again, weaker this time, followed by a voice. Not a stranger's voice. Not a call for help from the streets. It was his son. That word sliced through the fog of exhaustion and froze him in place. He unlatched the door and Marcus fell into his arms like dead weight. Bruises, blood trembling. The boy who once ran across playgrounds and shouted for him to watch now crumpled like a broken man at his feet. He carried him inside, every step echoing with a rage he barely contained. The house was dim, only the yellow porch light casting harsh shadows across the living room. He laid Marcus down on the couch, his hands shaking not from fear, but from fury. Every bruise told a story, and each one was uglier than the last. He cleaned the blood with trembling fingers, watching it smear across the cloth as though he were wiping away years of sacrifice, years of fatherhood, that had led to this moment of betrayal and pain. The city had beaten him down before, but never like this, never through his own flesh and blood. He wanted to call out to demand answers, but the look in Marcus's eyes stopped him. Fear, shame, the kind that men carried when they thought speaking the truth made them weaker. He could see the words caught in his throat, strangled by terror. The phone buzzed on the table screen, lighting up again and again. Threats flashed across the lock screen like poison written in digital ink. His son flinched every time. He didn't need to see more. He knew enough. The enemy wasn't a nameless thug on the street. It was family by marriage, a woman who had sworn to love his boy and instead turned him into prey. He pulled the blanket tighter around Marcus, covering him as though the fabric itself could shield him from the ugliness outside. But inside the storm was building. Every muscle in his body tightened. Every memory of raising his son, teaching him to throw a ball, working double shifts to pay for school clothes, sitting through church sermons where the preacher spoke about duty and sacrifice, crashed against the reality of this night. His son wasn't just hurt. He was shattered. And someone had done this deliberately. The night pressed in heavy against the walls. Dogs barked in the distance. Somewhere down the block, a car stereo rattled with bass, oblivious to the war igniting inside this house. He sat in the dark beside Marcus, listening to his shallow breaths, rage and grief tangling like barbed wire in his chest. He thought about the uniform folded in his closet, the badge that had given him authority for decades. But tonight, it wasn't the badge that mattered. It was the blood bond between father and son. The minutes dragged. He thought of Caroline, Marcus's late mother, and what she would say if she saw this. He could almost hear her voice, the softness and the steel mixed together, reminding him that family meant protection at any cost. That voice only sharpened the blade of his anger. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, fists clenching, unclenching as though preparing for a fight he already knew was inevitable. Sleep was no longer possible. The exhaustion of the shift was gone, burned out by adrenaline and fury. When dawn broke, the neighborhood was already stirring, kids shouting on their way to school, the smell of frying bacon drifting through cracked windows. But inside his house there was only silence, the heavy kind that follows a battle you haven't fought yet. Marcus stirred on the couch, his eyes barely opening, whispering apologies, as if he were the one who had failed. The father bent down, gripping his hand firmly, his voice a low growl that carried both promise and threat. Nothing about this was his son's fault. The ones who laid hands on him would answer for it. The father walked to the closet, opened the door, and stared at the uniform waiting inside. The blue shirt, the heavy belt, the holster. Tools of the job, yes, but tonight they were something more. They were armor. He slid the shirt on slowly, button by button, each click of the plastic like a drumbeat in his chest. The exhaustion from the night before had vanished, replaced by a cold clarity. He holstered his weapon not out of habit, but out of intent. He was no longer simply an officer keeping order in the streets. He was a father preparing for war. The city outside kept moving, oblivious to the storm gathering in one man's chest. Cars rolled down cracked roads, shopkeepers lifted metal shutters, children laughed on the sidewalks. Life carried on. But inside that small house, something had shifted forever. The line between law and vengeance blurred with every breath he took. His son's broken face replayed in his mind like a crime scene photograph he could never unsee. He sat at the table, poured himself black coffee, and stared into the dark surface as though it could answer the questions clawing at him. How had it come to this? How had the son he raised ended up in the hands of someone who would destroy him? He took a sip, bitter liquid searing down his throat, and decided the questions didn't matter anymore. Only the answers he would carve out mattered now. Outside, the sun climbed higher, washing the neighborhood in gold light. But in his house the light was harsh, almost surgical, revealing every scar, every line on his face, every shadow in his eyes. He leaned back in the chair, phone in hand, thumb hovering over numbers he hadn't dialed in years. Old contacts, old allies, people who owed him favors, people who knew how to fight in ways the law couldn't. He scrolled past them, paused, then stopped. He didn't need the streets. Not yet. He needed strategy. He needed precision. He opened his laptop, plugged in the flash drive from the neighbor's security camera, and replayed the footage again and again. Marcus at the door, knocking with the last of his strength collapsing into his father's arms. Each frame seared into his memory, not as evidence, but as a call to arms. He saved it, encrypted it, duplicated it on another drive. He wasn't just reacting, he was preparing. The clock ticked toward noon, and he closed the laptop. His hand rested on the table, steady now, no longer trembling with fury, but humming with resolve. The city outside thought it was just another day. They were wrong. Today was the first move in a war that would not end quietly. He stood shoulders squared, voice steady as he whispered to no one, or maybe to everyone who would ever try to harm what was his. They will never forget this day. And what came next would shake more than one life apart. When the door swung open, Marcus crumpled into his father's arms like a rag doll stripped of its stuffing. His weight was shocking, not because it was heavy, but because it felt hollow, as though life had been drained out of him. His skin was damp with sweat, and when the porch light caught his face, the sight carved itself into memory. His left eye swollen shut. His lips split. Blood caked at the corner of his mouth, jaw trembling as he tried to form words that wouldn't come. His father steadied him, arms locked around the same son he once carried on his shoulders, down cracked sidewalks after Sunday service, when laughter used to echo louder than gunshots in the neighborhood. That boy who once played stickball in the alley, who dreamed of escaping the block, was now trembling like a child caught in a storm. He pulled Marcus inside, shutting the door with the heel of his boot, the lock clicking into place, like a seal against the outside world. The living room was dim, a single lamp casting shadows across walls lined with family photos. Marcus at graduation. Marcus in his first Little League uniform. Marcus with his mother before illness took her too soon. Each photo seemed to stare back in silent accusation, asking how it had come to this moment. He laid Marcus gently onto the couch, his hands hovering, unsure where to touch without causing pain. The bruises stretched across his cheek like dark fingerprints, evidence of hands that had no right to mark him. Marcus tried to speak, voice breaking into stutters, each syllable jagged. His father hushed him, pressing a rough hand to his shoulder, whispering that he was safe, that no one would hurt him again. But even as he said it, the lie tasted bitter. Safety was a fragile illusion in this house tonight. He fetched a damp cloth from the kitchen, the faucet squealing as water sputtered, and returned to dab gently at the blood. Every swipe of the cloth drew more crimson, as if the wound itself wanted to testify, to scream out its story. His son winced, but didn't pull away. The smell of iron filled the room, sharp and metallic. His father swallowed hard, forcing down the bile rising in his throat. He had seen blood before, too much of it spilled on sidewalks and in squad cars. But this was different. This wasn't a stranger. This was his flesh and blood, the boy he had shielded from the streets, the boy he had worked overtime shifts to keep in clean sneakers and full bellies. He thought of the years he spent pulling Marcus away from corners where older boys hustled, warning him that the world outside their door would eat him alive. But nothing had prepared him for this. The enemy wasn't the block, or the gangs, or the drugs. It was the woman Marcus had trusted to share his life. Marcus shifted, groaning, clutching his ribs with trembling fingers. His father gently pulled his hands away, lifting the edge of his shirt. What he saw made him inhale sharply, air slicing into his lungs like glass. Purple-black bruises sprawled across his abdomen, angry blotches layered over one another, proof of repeated blows. Not an accident, not one moment of rage. This was deliberate, sustained, a punishment designed to break him. His father froze, cloth slipping from his hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. For a moment the room was silent, save for Marcus's shallow breaths. He wanted to roar, to curse the world, to kick down the walls and hunt her down right then, but he forced the fury into his gut where it simmered like molten steel. He couldn't explode, not yet. His son needed care before vengeance. His voice softened, barely audible, as he told Marcus to stay still, that he would handle everything. The boy's eyes flickered open, glassy and wet, and in that moment he looked younger than he had in years. Not the grown man who had once boasted about new jobs and big dreams, but the boy who used to fall asleep in the pew beside him at church, head resting against his shoulder, safe under the hum of gospel choirs. That innocence had been stolen, and the thief was still out there breathing. The phone buzzed again on the table, vibrating against the wood, a series of calls and messages lighting up the cracked screen. His father caught a glimpse of the words, threats, intimidation, promises of ruin if Marcus dared speak. Marcus lunged weakly, snatching the phone with panic in his eyes, whispering not to look, not to touch. That fear was worse than the bruises. Fear that deep meant control, meant manipulation, meant he was still shackled even while lying broken on this couch. His father didn't argue. He simply placed his hand over Marcus's, grounding him, a silent promise that no one would touch him again. The hours stretched, the weight of the night pressing down. His father sat there staring at his son, the rage inside him condensing into something sharper, colder. He thought of every sermon he'd ever heard about turning the other cheek, about forgiveness and patience. Tonight those words felt like dust. There was no sermon for this, no scripture for a father staring at the wreckage of his son's body. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about justice. Marcus dozed fitfully, wincing even in sleep, muttering apologies that broke his father's heart. Apologies for waking him, for being a burden, as if survival itself required apology. He sat beside him, jaw clenched, watching the shadows shift across the walls as the night dragged on. Outside, a police siren wailed, fading into the distance, and for once he wasn't the one answering. He was a father tonight, not a cop, and the war that waited beyond the door wasn't one he could arrest away. When dawn finally cracked the horizon light seeping pale and cold through the blinds, his father was still there, unmoving eyes fixed on the boy who once symbolized every reason he had to fight in this world. The exhaustion of the shift was gone, burned away by something harder than fury resolve. He leaned forward, whispered into Marcus's ear, words his son wouldn't remember come morning, words spoken like an oath that this would never happen again, that the one who had done this would pay, and that no court, no badge, no wall would shield them from what was coming. And yet even as he sat there making silent promises, the knock that would follow later that day would show him just how deep this betrayal ran, and how far he would have to go to make things right. He laid Marcus on the couch with the gentleness of a man handling something already shattered, afraid the slightest touch would turn cracks into dust. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, each inhale sounding like a struggle against the silence pressing in on the room. His father fetched a bowl of water, the faucet's screech echoing in the kitchen, and carried it back with a cloth trembling in his calloused hand. Kneeling beside the couch, he dipped the cloth, squeezed it until drops pattered onto the hardwood floor, then began to wipe the blood from his son's face. The cloth turned crimson almost instantly, and with each swipe he felt the pain, as though the bruise had been struck into his own ribs, carved into his own jaw. He dabbed at the split lip, the swelling eye, the ugly purple spreading across Marcus's cheek. Each mark was a confession, a map of cruelty drawn across skin that had once been untouched by anything but a father's rough but loving hand. Rage climbed his throat thick and suffocating, but he forced it back down. He couldn't roar now, not when his son needed his hand steady. His fingers brushed Marcus's temple, and the boy flinched, a soft whimper escaping his throat that broke the father more than any wound ever had. He whispered assurances, words he barely believed himself, words that sounded hollow even as they left his mouth. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you again." But the room itself mocked him with silence, with the buzzing of the phone still lighting up with threats on the table, with the memory of fists that had already broken through the promise of safety. He pressed the cloth to Marcus's ribs, and the boy gasped, his body arching away instinctively. His father froze, eyes, burning teeth, grinding until his jaw ached. He was supposed to be the shield, the wall against the world, but the enemy wasn't outside. It had slept under the same roof as his son's sworn vows in front of God and family. He adjusted the blanket around Marcus, tucking it beneath his chin, a gesture as useless as it was tender. The boy's eyes fluttered shut, but even in sleep his body twitched with the memory of blows, his hand occasionally jerking upward as though warding off invisible strikes. His father sat back on his heels, staring at the ceiling as though answers were written there, but all he found was the emptiness of the room and the weight of his own helplessness. The cloth slipped from his hand into the bowl, water rippling red. He thought of every time he had warned Marcus about the world, every talk they'd had at the kitchen table after church about choosing the right path, every lecture about responsibility and courage. He had feared drugs, gangs, guns, the dangers of the block. Never once had he feared that the greatest threat would come from the hands of someone wearing a wedding ring. The irony sliced him open. He rose, pacing the living room, the floorboards groaning under his boots. His eyes landed on the photographs again. Marcus as a boy, smiling with a missing front tooth, his mother's arm wrapped around him. The sight was a knife twist. What would Caroline have said if she had seen this? He could almost hear her voice, warm but unyielding, telling him that love didn't mean blindness, that family meant fighting harder than the streets ever demanded. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. He had fought criminals, thugs, even his own exhaustion, night after night. But nothing had left him feeling this powerless. A low groan pulled him back. Marcus stirred, murmuring words too broken to form sentences, apologies tangled with sobs. His father leaned in, brushing sweat from his forehead, whispering that there was nothing to apologize for, that none of this was his fault. But even as he said it, Marcus's expression twisted with guilt, like he had failed by surviving, like he had somehow deserved the punishment. That shame, heavier than any bruise, was the cruelest wound of all. The father sat again, wiping his face with his hand, the stubble scratching his palm. He stared at the bowl of water, now stained pink, at the cloth limp at the bottom. Every drop represented a strike, a moment he hadn't been there. The helplessness was unbearable, but beneath it rage grew roots. He would not weep tonight. He would not break. There was no space for weakness, only planning, only resolve. He checked Marcus's pulse, steady but fragile, then rose and moved to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered shadows stretching across cracked pavement. The neighborhood was asleep, but inside this house war had already begun. He returned to the couch, pulling a chair close, sitting so his son would see him if he opened his eyes. His hand rested on Marcus's arm, not to restrain, not to test, but to anchor him. His thumb brushed the edge of a bruise, and for the first time all night his son did not flinch. A small victory, but one that steadied him. He whispered again that he was safe, and though he didn't believe the word, he vowed to make it true. As the hours stretched, his exhaustion gnawed at him, but adrenaline kept his body sharp, his mind sharper. He catalogued every wound, every tremor, every look of fear. Each detail was evidence, each mark a statement that would one day be read aloud in court or confronted in the streets. He was no longer just a father tending to his broken son. He was a man gathering fuel for retribution. The night crept on, minutes dragging like chains, until the first gray streaks of dawn pressed against the blinds. Marcus slept finally, though his breathing was uneven. His father didn't move, didn't dare. He sat in silence, the rage in his chest no longer a wildfire, but a cold, focused burn. He reached for the phone, scrolled through numbers, his finger hovering. Allies, old partners, men who owed him favors. But he stopped short, shutting the phone down. Not yet. First he needed more proof, more leverage, more certainty. He leaned back, eyes fixed on his son, face hardening into something carved from stone. The helplessness had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon waiting to be sharpened. And he knew when the moment came, when the storm finally broke, that weapon would strike with precision. And yet, just as resolve began to settle in his bones, a faint sound outside caught his ear, a car engine idling too long in front of the house. He rose slowly, every nerve alive, and peered through the blinds. What he saw parked at the curb made his stomach tighten and his hand drift toward the holster at his hip. The night was not finished with them yet. When Marcus's trembling hands pulled up the hem of his shirt, the father's breath locked in his throat. The dim lamplight revealed a landscape of damage carved into his son's skin. A deep purple bruise swelling across his ribs, spreading like ink through paper. It wasn't one strike. It wasn't a single moment of anger. It was a campaign, repeated and deliberate, each blow layered on top of the last, designed to break him down piece by piece. For a long moment, the father couldn't move. His lungs refused to pull in air, as if the sight itself had stolen the oxygen from the room. His jaw clenched until his teeth ached, rage and helplessness colliding, steel and fire forging something inside him that would never return to what it had been. His fingers hovered inches from Marcus's skin, torn between touching and recoiling, afraid that even the brush of his hand might send his son deeper into agony. Marcus's eyes darted away, ashamed, as though the wounds were his fault, as though the evidence of his suffering somehow made him weaker. That shame was the cruelest part, and his father felt it like a blade slicing into his own chest. He whispered his son's name, his voice low, almost reverent, but the boy kept his gaze fixed on the floorboards. The father stood abruptly, pacing the room with heavy steps, the floor groaning under his boots. His hands curled into fists at his sides, knuckles, pale veins rising like cords under his skin. Every fiber of him screamed to storm out of the house, to find her, to drag her into the street, and let the world see what she had done. But the badge tucked away in his closet, and the years of discipline that came with it, held him back barely. He wasn't free to be reckless, not yet. Vengeance would come, but it had to be more than rage. It had to be final. He turned back toward the couch, forcing his body to still. Marcus had lowered his shirt again, clutching it like armor, shoulders shaking as he tried to hold back sobs. The father crouched in front of him, lowering his voice to a steady calm that cost him everything to maintain. He told Marcus the truth he should have never doubted, that no bruise could define him, no act of cruelty could erase the man he was, and no shame belonged to him. The shame belonged to the one who struck him. The words landed, but his son's silence told him the wounds cut deeper than flesh. The night dragged forward, shadows shifting, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The father pulled out his phone, flicking through the camera until the screen glowed against the dark. He asked Marcus for permission, and though his son's nod was hesitant, it was enough. He lifted the shirt again, and this time the lens captured everything. The bruises, the welts, the truth carved in violet and black. Each click of the shutter was an oath, each flash of light a promise that this violence would not vanish into silence. After Marcus leaned back, drained eyes closing as though sleep might hide him from the weight of the world, his father sat beside him, phone in hand, scrolling through the images with a grim focus. Evidence. Ammunition. Proof that no court, no jury, no soul with a shred of conscience could ignore. He uploaded the photos to the cloud, encrypted them, sent them to an email only he controlled. He wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was preparing for battle. The house was suffocating, the air thick with the sour smell of sweat and blood. He cracked a window, letting the night breeze creep in, carrying faint sounds of the city, the distant rumble of a train, the bark of a dog, the low thump of music from a car rolling past. The normalcy of it infuriated him. How could the world keep moving while his son sat broken in his living room? How could people laugh, drive live, when the person he loved most had been reduced to bruises and whispers? He returned to Marcus's side, adjusting the blanket once more, though he knew it did little against the cold reality pressing down on them both. He stared at his son's face, swollen but still familiar. Still his boy. Still the child he had raised through hunger and hardship, through nights when the heater broke and they bundled together under coats, through mornings when pancakes were made from the last bit of mix, just to give him joy. That same boy was here, alive, but broken, and it ignited a fury so pure it bordered on holy. The clock ticked past 3, each second louder than the last. The father leaned back in his chair, exhaustion clawing at him, but unable to break through the storm inside. He thought about every bruise, every cry, every message flashing across Marcus's phone, and the rage that had once threatened to consume him, now sharpened into something colder. He knew the law. He knew procedure. But more than that, he knew how the streets worked, how silence could kill a man faster than any weapon. He would not be silent. Marcus stirred, whispering in his sleep apologies tangled with half-formed words. His father reached out, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder, whispering back promises meant for both of them. Promises that this would end. That the next chapter of this story would not be written in bruises, but in retribution. Outside, the night began to thin, the horizon just starting to pale with the suggestion of dawn. He rose, moving to the window again, peering out through the blinds. The same car from earlier was still there, engine off, now a shadow inside the cabin, unmoving. His stomach tightened, instincts flaring. This wasn't just a coincidence, someone was watching, waiting. He stepped back from the blinds, his face settling into something harder than resolve. The bruises had spoken. The evidence was gathered. And if they thought fear would keep him still, they were about to learn what a father stripped of helplessness and fueled by rage was truly capable of. And the knock that finally came at the door, sharp and deliberate, would make it clear that the fight was only beginning. The glow of the phone cut through the dimness like a blade, each buzz a pulse of menace in the quiet room. The words flashed across the screen again and again, threats delivered without hesitation, crafted to silence and suffocate. Say one more word, and you'll lose everything. The father's jaw tightened, the veins in his temples rising, his hand inching toward the device with the reflex of a man who had spent a lifetime intercepting danger. But before his fingers touched the glass, Marcus jolted upright, his bruised hands snatching the phone with a desperation that was more than fear. It was terror that had rooted itself deep in his bones. His wide eyes met his father's, pleading silently, the kind of look that spoke of secrets too heavy to be carried, yet too dangerous to release. The father froze, not because of his son's resistance, but because of the panic behind it. This wasn't just a battered man shielding his abuser. This was someone living inside a cage built of threats, locked from the inside by shame, and from the outside by manipulation. The messages weren't just words, they were chains. He had seen gang leaders control their recruits with the same tactics seen dealers enslave addicts without ever lifting a hand. Fear did the work more efficiently than fists. And now that same sickness had seeped into his son's life, poisoning every breath. Marcus clutched the phone to his chest like it was both shield and curse. His knuckles whitened, his breath quickened, his shoulders curled inward. The father leaned forward slowly, his voice low, measured the tone he used in interrogation rooms, when coaxing the truth out of men who swore they would never break. He told Marcus he didn't need to protect anyone but himself now. He told him the fight wasn't his alone anymore. But Marcus only shook his head, tears welling, jaw clamped shut against words he couldn't risk speaking aloud. The phone buzzed again. The father's eyes flicked to the screen, catching just enough a photo of Marcus outside his own workplace, time-stamped, followed by another message promising ruin. His stomach turned fury, mingling with dread. This wasn't random violence. It was surveillance control so invasive it had infiltrated every corner of his son's life. He wanted to rip the phone from Marcus's hands, to answer the messages himself, to spit back fire through the wires. But he stayed still. If the enemy was watching this closely, rash moves would only tighten their grip. He sat back, breathing through clenched teeth, watching Marcus crumble under the weight of silence. Every flinch, every quick glance toward the window, every way his shoulders hunched as though expecting a blow at any second, told the truth louder than words ever could. The father reached for the damp cloth again, not to clean this time, but to have something in his hands that wasn't a weapon. His palms itched for action, for violence, but instead he pressed the cloth flat against the table until water pooled out, dripping onto the wood. He was forcing himself to wait, to listen, to learn before he struck. The night deepened around them, but the house felt smaller, compressed by the weight of invisible eyes. He moved to the blinds again, peering through the narrow slits, his gaze sweeping across the street. The same car sat at the curb, unmoving, its silhouette blending into shadow. He narrowed his eyes, noting the faint ember of a cigarette glowing in the driver's seat. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide completely. They wanted to be seen, wanted to remind Marcus he was never out of reach. He let the blinds fall back into place and turned the anger on his face, tempered into something sharper. He crouched in front of his son again, this time taking Marcus's hands, gently prying them away from the phone. He didn't demand, didn't raise his voice, just looked him straight in the eye and told him no man had the right to hold him hostage like this. He told him fear was exactly the weapon they counted on, and that together they would strip it away piece by piece. For a second, Marcus's resolve cracked, and he whispered something barely audible, that they had people everywhere, that talking meant destruction not only for him, but for his father as well. The father squeezed his hand, steady, unwavering. "Let them watch," he said. "Let them threaten." He had spent decades staring into the eyes of predators who thrived on silence, and he had broken every single one of them. This time it wasn't just duty. It was blood. He promised Marcus that the fear burning him alive would not last, that the cage around him was already cracking. Marcus's grip loosened on the phone, and for the first time that night he let it drop onto the cushion beside him. The father didn't reach for it. Not yet. He knew when to press and he knew when to wait. Instead, he draped the blanket tighter around his son, the gesture as fierce as any vow, then rose to his feet with a weight that was no longer exhaustion but determination. He glanced once more at the window, at the silent car waiting in the dark. and his jaw set like stone. The house was quiet again, save for the rhythmic buzz of the phone still alive on the couch, each vibration another taunt. But he wasn't listening to the threats anymore. He was listening to the rhythm beneath them, the pattern of control, the language of intimidation. It was the same game he had dismantled on the streets, the same machinery of power he had seen collapse under pressure. And he knew how to bring it down. He turned back toward Marcus, who had finally drifted into a restless sleep, and allowed himself one moment to brush his son's hair from his forehead. Then he straightened the silence around him, filled not with helplessness but with strategy. The battle wasn't going to be fought in shadows anymore. It was going to be dragged into the light. And just as he made that decision, the faint sound of footsteps outside the front door reminded him that the confrontation wasn't far away. It was already on his doorstep, waiting for him to open the door. The emergency room smelled of bleach and despair, a cocktail of antiseptic and human suffering that clung to the skin. Marcus lay stretched out on the gurney, his body dwarfed by the sterile white sheets. Bruises glaring under the fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like flies. Machines hummed around him, tracking every fragile beat of his heart, every shallow breath that seemed to scrape its way out of his chest. His father stood at the foot of the bed, boots rooted to the tile, unable to move forward, unable to step away. The badge in his pocket weighed heavier than it ever had in decades of service, a reminder of a duty he had fulfilled for strangers, but somehow failed for his own blood. Doctor Johnson moved like a man who had seen too much but still cared enough to write every detail with meticulous precision. He noted the contusions, measured the swelling, pressed carefully along Marcus's ribs until a sharp cry broke from his son's throat, echoing through the sterile room. Each sound was another lash against the father's chest. He wanted to step in to shield him from the probing hands, but he knew it was necessary. Evidence had to be documented, injuries cataloged with clinical detachment. Justice demanded it. But watching his son flinch under another man's examination tore him apart in ways no bullet or knife ever had. The clipboard snapped shut, and Dr. Johnson gave a quiet nod, promising the report would be thorough. He mentioned terms like assault, sustained trauma, likely repeated incidents. The words landed like gunfire in the father's ears. He had arrested men for less. He had sworn to protect, to intervene before the damage stacked this high. Yet here was Marcus beaten, not by a stranger in an alley, but by someone who had once been welcomed at family dinners, smiled for photographs, exchanged vows beneath a church roof. That betrayal carried a weight no training had prepared him for. As nurses wrapped bandages and started IV lines, the father's gaze lingered on his son's face. Even under swelling, he could still see the boy he had raised, the stubborn tilt of his jaw, the familiar set of his brow when he was fighting to stay strong. But now those features were cloaked in exhaustion and pain that dulled his spirit. Guilt surged through him thick as tar, choking him with questions that had no answers. How had he missed the signs? When had the distance grown so wide that his son endured this torment alone, until his body collapsed under the weight? He stepped closer, brushing a hand along Marcus's arm, the IV taped against his skin. His son stirred eyelids, heavy eyes half opening to meet his. For a moment father and son locked gazes, and the boy's lips parted, but only a faint whisper slipped out. Sorry. That single word cut deeper than any blade. Sorry for being beaten, for being weak, for being here. His father gripped his hand firm, refusing to let the word linger in the air. He told him he had nothing to apologize for, that the blame was not his to carry. But inside the guilt only grew heavier because the truth clawed at him. He had sworn to protect, and he had failed. The hallway beyond the curtain buzzed with chaos. Stretchers wheeled past, intercoms blaring names, the shuffle of shoes across linoleum. But inside the small square of this room, time had slowed. He remembered nights spent patrolling these same streets, believing his work made the city safer for the next generation. Yet safety hadn't reached his own doorstep. The irony was merciless. He had caught thieves, locked up murderers, but he hadn't been there to stop the slow, insidious violence eating away at his son's spirit. Dr. Johnson returned briefly, his expression grave but professional. He asked if Marcus had support at home if law enforcement had been notified. The father hesitated, feeling the weight of the badge in his pocket pressing like a brand against his thigh. He was law enforcement. He should have been the shield. Yet in this moment he wasn't sure whether to trust the system he had served or to carve justice with his own hands. He muttered that it was being handled, voice low, eyes steady. The doctor nodded, but the pause lingered between them, unspoken understanding passing like smoke. When the staff finally left them alone, the father pulled a chair close to the bed. He sat there, elbows braced on his knees, staring at the rise and fall of his son's chest. The machines beeped steadily, indifferent to the storm tearing through him. He thought of Caroline again. Marcus's mother gone too soon. What would she say if she saw their boy like this? Would she condemn him for not protecting him? Or would she remind him, as she always had, that the fight wasn't over until justice was done? He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of memory and regret pressing down, then opened them again with new steel in his gaze. The guilt did not vanish. It never would. But it began to transform, hardening into something else, resolve. He rose, walking to the sink in the corner, splashing cold water over his face, staring into the mirror above it. His reflection looked older, lines etched deeper by grief. But behind his eyes was fire. He dried his hands, turned back to Marcus, and made a silent vow. He couldn't erase what had been done, but he could decide what happened next. As the night bled into morning, the fluorescent lights above flickered, humming like distant static. Marcus shifted in his sleep, his breathing shallow but steady. The father remained beside him, a sentinel, his thoughts sharpening into plans. The threats, the bruises, the fear, they had all built a case. But more than that, they had built a reckoning. And when the door to the ER creaked open again, revealing a shadow he did not expect, he realized that the path forward would not simply be about healing wounds. It would be about confronting an enemy who already knew he was here and who wasn't finished yet. Back at the house, the silence was heavier than any siren or gunshot he had ever heard. The walls seemed to breathe with the weight of everything that had happened, as if the old wood itself carried witness to the betrayal. He moved straight to the closet, fingers brushing past shirts and jackets until they found the familiar fabric of his uniform. He pulled it out slowly, draping it across the bed like armor waiting for war. The sight of it steadied him. He wasn't just a father tonight. He was a soldier preparing for a campaign that would not be lost. He reached for the phone and dialed Harold Lewis, an attorney who had once sat across from him in courtrooms, a man who had battled him tooth and nail in cases years ago. But Harold was also one of the few men he trusted, someone who knew how to bend the system without breaking it, how to twist rules just enough to make them bleed truth. When Harold answered with his gravel voice, the father's words were clipped and cold. He told him what had happened, and Harold, after a long pause, said simply, "Gather everything. Leave nothing out. This fight is already bigger than you know." He ended the call, then walked back into the living room where Marcus lay beneath the lamp's weak glow, still half conscious. He carried the camera from the hall closet, the one he had used to capture birthdays, graduations, first days of school. Tonight it would serve a different purpose. He crouched beside his son, his hand hovering, asking permission without words. Marcus gave the smallest nod, a surrender born of exhaustion and trust. The father lifted the shirt again, and the first flash cracked through the room. The image froze his son's body in brutal stillness. The deep bruise along the ribs, the swelling along the jaw, the cuts etched into his skin. He clicked again and again, each burst of light exposing another layer of the truth. His chest tightened with every shot. It felt like he was documenting a crime scene, except the victim was his own blood. And yet he forced himself to keep going. Proof mattered. Without it, the violence could be denied, minimized, buried. He refused to let that happen. Each photo became more than evidence. They became vows. Vows that his son's pain would not disappear in paperwork or fade under excuses. He adjusted angles, zoomed close, capturing the fingerprint-shaped bruises that lined Marcus's arms, the purple welts that wrapped around his torso, the raw cut along his lip. Each flash was a hammer strike inside his chest, but also a promise that the silence was over. When the camera finally clicked empty, its memory full, he lowered it, staring at the screen where the images scrolled past one after another. His hand shook not with weakness but with rage so sharp it hummed under his skin. He uploaded the photos, immediately securing them in encrypted files, sending copies to Harold with a single message, for court and for war. He turned then, noticing Marcus had drifted back into shallow sleep. The boy's face, bruised and swollen, was still beautiful to him. Still his son, still the child he had raised from scraped knees to graduation gowns. He tucked the blanket tighter, brushed his hair gently from his forehead, and whispered that he was proud of him. Not for enduring the pain, but for surviving it long enough to tell the truth, even if only through bruises. He rose and walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, staring out the window into the night. The same car still sat across the street, its silhouette unmoved, predatory in its patience. He felt the weight of their gaze even through the glass. He wanted to march out there, drag the driver onto the pavement, and demand names. But not yet. Not without finishing what he started. He wasn't going to let rage rob him of strategy. Instead, he opened his laptop at the kitchen table, uploading the photos again, layering them with notes from Dr. Johnson's report. The files became a case, piece by piece, a net tightening around the abuser who thought fear could keep the truth buried. He typed with steady fingers, every keystroke echoing with intent. His badge sat beside the laptop, a reminder of the line he had walked for decades. Tonight, the badge felt like both a weapon and a chain. But he knew one thing: he wouldn't let it hold him back if the law failed to act. The hours crawled, and with every minute his resolve grew sharper. He organized the photos into folders, labeled the files meticulously, as if the structure itself gave him control over chaos. He replayed the sound of Marcus's voice in his head, the broken apologies, the gasps of pain. Those memories fueled him, shaping his plan. He was no longer reacting. He was preparing. By the time the first threads of dawn began to bleed across the sky, the house was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of Marcus's breathing. The father stood, stretching the uniform still draped across the bed, waiting for him. He touched the fabric once, a silent promise, then turned back toward the window. The car across the street was gone now, but he knew that didn't mean safety. It meant movement. It meant the next move was already being played. He closed the laptop, slid the badge into his pocket, and holstered the weapon at his hip. His reflection in the dark window looked harder than it ever had, a man tempered by rage, guilt, and love forged into one. He whispered under his breath a vow meant only for himself, that whoever had laid hands on Marcus would learn what it meant to provoke a father who had nothing left to lose. And when the knock came again, louder this time, deliberate and taunting, he knew the time for gathering was over. The time for confrontation had begun. The morning light cut harsh through the blinds, painting sharp lines across the living room floor. The house still smelled of antiseptic wipes and blood-soaked cloths, the evidence of the night's quiet war. Marcus slept restlessly on the couch, shifting under the weight of his bruises, his face locked in a grimace even in dreams. His father sat near, eyes fixed on the front door, when a knock rattled softly against the wood. Not the threatening kind from the shadows outside, but gentle, steady, almost familiar. He rose cautiously, every muscle taut, and cracked the door just enough to see who stood there. Miss Johnson, the neighbor from across the street, stood with her back straight despite her age, a knit shawl draped over her shoulders. In one hand she held her phone, in the other a small bag of cornbread wrapped in foil. Her face bore lines of both kindness and steel. A woman who had seen too much of the world to be easily frightened. Without waiting to be invited, she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, landing finally on Marcus. The softness in her expression hardened into something fierce. She lowered herself into the chair beside the father and unlocked her phone with steady fingers. She pulled up a video, the grainy image from her door camera filling the small screen. There was Marcus, battered and desperate, pounding on his father's door with the last of his strength, his voice cracking as he begged to be let in. The sound of it pierced the air, even replayed, and the father felt the shame of that night's terror all over again. Miss Johnson turned the phone toward him, her hand resting on his. Her voice was low, unwavering. "Get justice for that boy. Don't let this slide." The weight of her words settled over him like armor. For hours he had carried the burden alone, rage and guilt gnawing at him in silence. But now, here was proof from someone outside these walls, and more than that, here was an ally. For the first time since Marcus collapsed into his arms, he felt less like a lone soldier and more like part of a force. He thanked her quietly, his voice rough, but she shook her head, silencing him with a look. She had raised sons of her own, buried one too young, watched another slip into prison, and she knew the cost of silence. She told him the neighborhood was not blind. People had heard the shouting, seen the car idling too long in front of the house. Fear had kept them quiet, but fear couldn't live forever. She said sometimes it takes one person to remind the rest what courage looks like. He saved the video to his phone, securing it alongside the photographs and reports, building a case that was no longer just his private crusade, but a shared fight. Miss Johnson squeezed his hand once more, the gesture firm, filled with conviction, then rose and walked back toward the door. Before stepping out, she turned her eyes sharp as glass and warned him that the ones watching were not finished, that they would push back harder once they knew the walls were closing in. The father stood in the doorway after she left, watching her cross the street, the shawl fluttering behind her like a banner in the wind. The cornbread sat untouched on the table, the foil gleaming in the sunlight, but the phone in his hand buzzed with power. He replayed the video once more, the sound of Marcus's broken voice like a war cry hidden inside sorrow. It was proof not just of pain, but of survival. He turned to look at his son still sleeping and felt a surge of determination course through him. The loneliness of the night had cracked. Now he had allies, witnesses, a community ready, even if quietly, to stand with him. The clock ticked on each second, pressing him closer to the inevitable clash. He sat back down, staring at the screen, memorizing every detail of the footage, every timestamp, every flicker of shadow. And in the silence of that room, a thought sharpened inside him. Enemies who thought fear could isolate his family were about to learn what happens when fear turns into fury and spreads beyond the walls of a single house. And as dusk began to settle and the hum of another engine slowed outside, he knew the war was coming straight to his door sooner than he had planned. The first streaks of dawn crept through the blinds, thin blades of light cutting across the dining table where the father had laid out his arsenal. Not guns, not knives, but evidence, photographs of bruises. Medical reports, the shaky footage from Miss Johnson's door camera. Each piece sat in neat order, aligned like ammunition ready to be fired in the battles ahead. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer suffocated him. It fueled him. For the first time since Marcus collapsed into his arms, he no longer felt like a man drowning. He felt like a man rising steady and unyielding, forged into something harder than grief. He sat, tall hands clasped before him, staring at the evidence as though it were a map leading him to war. He wasn't just Marcus's father anymore. He was a black police officer with decades of street-hardened instincts, a man who had seen the city chew up families and spit them out, and he was done letting it happen to his own. The guilt that had weighed on him through the night now stood sharpened into resolve. This was no longer about what he had failed to prevent. It was about what he would ensure never happened again. He rose from the table, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed like the drawing of a sword. He moved to the closet and dressed with deliberate precision, pulling on his uniform piece by piece. The shirt slid over his shoulders like armor, the badge pinned to his chest catching the dim morning light. He strapped on his belt, holstered his weapon, laced his boots. Each motion was a vow renewed, each buckle cinched with a quiet fury that vibrated under his skin. By the time he looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror, the weary father from the night before was gone. What stared back was something else entirely. A soldier, a sentinel, A man who would not hesitate to bring war to the doorstep of anyone who dared touch his son again. Marcus stirred on the couch, mumbling in half-dreams, his body twitching as though still fending off blows that weren't there. His father stepped closer, watching his chest rise and fall, then placed a hand gently on his shoulder. For the first time, Marcus did not flinch. That small, fragile moment was enough to steady him even further. He whispered a promise his son would not hear, a vow spoken like scripture, that this fight belonged to him now, and it would not end until justice had been carved into the bones of those responsible. He returned to the table, gathered the files and photographs into a folder, slipped it under his arm. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the names again. Allies, old partners. Harold Lewis already working the legal angles. Miss Johnson holding the line with community proof. This wasn't just him anymore. The battlefield was widening, the sides already being drawn. He dialed one number and let it ring, then another, planting seeds in voices that had once walked beside him through darker nights. By the time he set the phone down, he knew he was no longer standing alone. Outside, the neighborhood stirred awake, unaware of the war blooming in its center. A jogger passed with earbuds and a child pedaled by on a rusted bike. A woman carried groceries from the corner store. The ordinary rhythm of life moved forward, but the father knew nothing was ordinary anymore. His house had become ground zero, and from this point forward, nothing would unfold quietly. He watched through the blinds, eyes narrowing at every car that lingered too long, every shadow that shifted against the curb. The car from the night before had vanished, but he knew better than to believe the threat had retreated. It was circling, waiting for its chance to strike. He moved back through the house, checking every lock, every window, each motion not born of paranoia, but preparation. His boots thudded against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing with authority. He paused in the kitchen, poured himself black coffee, and stood at the counter as steam curled into the morning light. He sipped slowly, his mind already racing through scenarios, weighing options. Would they try to silence Marcus directly? Would they come after him instead, hoping to cut off the shield protecting his son? He considered every angle, every possibility, and with each thought his resolve only hardened. The clock ticked louder. The hands crawling toward noon, and the air in the house seemed to shift. This was no longer simply survival. This was the moment the fight became his. He looked again at the folder under his arm, the proof ready to be unleashed, and felt a calm settle in his chest. Justice wasn't going to be begged for. It was going to be taken. He stepped into the living room once more, looking at Marcus, whose breathing had evened out, the tension in his face easing slightly. The father's eyes softened for a fleeting second, but then sharpened again as his gaze shifted to the door. He adjusted the badge on his chest, squared his shoulders, and stood tall. Every bruise on his son's body was a scar on his own soul, but now those scars had turned into fuel, into fire that would not burn out. And as he crossed the room toward the front door, folder in hand, the sound of tires crunching gravel outside drew him still. Another car had arrived, not creeping like the watchers from before, but pulling up bold, stopping square in front of the house. He moved to the window, peered through the blinds, and saw figures step out. Two men in suits, their faces set in grim lines, their eyes scanning the street before locking on his door. He exhaled slowly, one hand drifting to his holster, the other tightening on the folder under his arm. The war he had been preparing for all night was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived, standing at his doorstep, waiting for him to open the door. Life has a way of testing us in the quietest hours, when exhaustion and fear press hardest. This story is not only about a father protecting his son, but about the strength that rises when love collides with injustice. It reminds us that silence in the face of cruelty only feeds the abuser, while truth, documented, spoken, and defended, becomes a shield for those who cannot fight alone. For older generations who know sacrifice and resilience more than most, the lesson is clear. We are never too old, too tired, or too broken to stand up for what is right. Protecting family, defending dignity, and demanding accountability are not just duties. They are legacies we leave behind. And even when the world feels indifferent, allies can emerge in unexpected places, reminding us that justice is never fought alone. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments, whether it's a simple number, your age, or the city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story of love, betrayal, and the courage to fight back.